because they was jealous, they came up with a plot to sell Joseph off. At first, they was going to kill him, but we know that Reuben heard what they was going to do, and he stopped them from killing his brother, and they put him in a pit. And Reuben was planning on coming back to get Joseph and to take it back home to his father, but the brothers moved ahead, and some Midianites came by. And when they came by, they sold their brother, their own flesh and blood, into slavery. And we know that he ended up, turn on over with me to chapter 39. He ends up there at Potiphar's house. And Potiphar down in Egypt, when the Midianites bought him, they took him to Egypt, and they sold him for $2,650 to Potiphar. And Potiphar was the captain of the guard. He was the king's military man. He was the captain of the guard, and he was over all the military factor there down in Egypt. And as I was looking at this, I went down to verse 2 in chapter 39 real quick, and it said, and the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man. And everything that Joseph had touched, it became a wonderful to Pharaoh. He everything that he touched, he increased it. God increased it through Joseph. And Joseph found favor in Pharaoh, and Pharaoh gave him charge over his whole house, everything that he had, his finances, his property, everything. And Joseph had full charge. And Joseph, he kept his faith with God. He didn't do anything unless he considered God first. And then when you look at the text tonight, we're going to find out that because he was so faithful to God, the enemy kept coming after Joseph. He wouldn't leave him alone. And I said it because we know in last week's lesson, we know that Potiphar's wife came to Joseph and tried to make Joseph sleep with her. But Joseph was an honorable man. And Joseph said he would not go against what God had called him to be. And Joseph tried to stay away from her, but she tricked him one day and got him in the house alone. And the Bible teaches us here in the lesson that when they was alone, and she pulled on Joseph's gown because Joseph wouldn't come to her. And Joseph fled out of the room and left this gown there. And she became frustrated with Joseph. And the Bible teaches us here in chapter 39 that when she became frustrated, she called the guards in and said, come and look what this Hebrew had tried to do to me. He tried to sleep with me. And she lied on Joseph. And because of that, Pharaoh put Joseph in jail. And Joseph said that God had gave me everything, charge over Pharaoh's whole house. But one thing that he not give me was Pharaoh's wife. And Joseph was an honorable man. He said, I'm not going to do anything against God. And because of that, Pharaoh put him in jail. And y'all know the story when we got down to chapter 4, how when he was put in jail in chapter 40, when he was put in jail, and the chief butler and the chief guard, a baker, had got thrown in jail as well. Pharaoh had got frustrated with them, and he threw them in jail. And while they was in jail, they met this young man by the name of Joseph. And before we go any further tonight, I want us to remember what we talked about on last week. There's three things that faith does. Faith sees the invisible. Faith believes the impossible. And faith receives the incredible. The three things that faith will do. And we're seeing all three things manifesting themselves in this lesson. Joseph had faith. He believed he seen the invisible. He believed the impossible. And then he turns around and received the incredible. I went down tonight, and we're going to start with chapter 40. And I wanted to go to verse 16, if you will. Well, let me start with verse 14, and we'll move quickly. Verse 14. He said, but think on me when it shall be well with thee. We know that Joseph had interpreted the dream both for the butler and for the baker. And he told them to think of him. When you get out of here, tell Pharaoh to don't forget about me. I'm still here. I've been here longer than you guys stayed. And he said, he still had faith. He said, I believe I'm going to get out of here, but tell Pharaoh that I'm still here. I went down to verse 14 in chapter 40, and it said, but think on me when it shall be well with thee, and show kindness, I pray thee, unto me, and make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of his house. Bring me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also have I done nothing that should put me into this dungeon. He's still confessing that he is innocent. And sometimes in life, folk will charge you with stuff, and if you know that you're innocent, if you know that you hadn't did what they say you're doing, you stick to what you know. Stick to the truth, and the truth, as we always say, will set you free. Well, Pastor, he's been in here for a while now, and don't look like he's going to get out. The baker and the butler have forgot about him and the good deed that he done. But when you tell the truth eventually is going to set you free. I went down to verse 17, and it said, and in the utmost basket, well, let me go back to verse 16. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said unto Joseph, I also was in a dream. And behold, I had 3 white baskets on my head. And the upper basket there was of all manner of baked meat for Pharaoh. And the birds did eat them out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation thereof. The 3 baskets are 3 days. And yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up our head from off thee and hang thee on a tree. And the birds shall eat thy flesh off of thee. Now, he had courage to tell this baker that you ain't going to make it. He said, Pharaoh is going to kill you. And let me say this tonight. Sometimes, not sometimes, all the time, even when it's not favorable to someone, we should always tell them the truth and don't give them false hope. And the vision that God gave Joseph to tell this butler was that you ain't gonna make it. And I went down to verse 19. He said, yet within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up thy head off of thee and hang thee on a tree, and birds should eat of thee from off thee. And it came to pass the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday. Pharaoh's getting ready to throw a big party. And as he threw that party, that he had made a feast unto all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker upon his servants. And he restored the chief butler, but he hanged the baker on a tree. In verse 22, he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgot him. Can we put a pin in there tonight? Because see, when people tell you something and they wanting something from you, they forget what they promised you that they're going to do after they get out of their situation. And this happened to Joseph here. When the chief baker got out, he forgot about the chief butler got out. He forgot about Joseph. And then go down over to chapter 40, if you will. I'm trying to move fast so we can get to the new lesson tonight. But Joseph tests with Pharaoh's dream. Now, Joseph had the test with the dream of the butler and also the dream of the baker. Now here, he's going to have a test with Pharaoh's dream. And in chapter 41, in verse 1, it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh's dream, and behold, he stood by the river. And behold, there came up out of the river 7 well-favored kinds, cows, fat flesh, and they fed in the meadow. And behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ill-favored. They were scrawny, lean flesh. And then in verse 4, and the ill-favored and the lean flesh kind did eat up the 7 well-favored and fat kind. So Pharaoh woke up. Now he said, the vision that I had, that I seen cows come up out of the river. Some of them was fat and full, and the rest of them was lean and poor and skinny. But I seen the poor one eat up the flesh one. I seen, he said here that in verse 6, and behold, 7 thin ears of blast of corn was with the east wind sprung up after them. Then in verse 7, and then the seventh end is devoured. He's telling him the second part of the dream. In verse 7, and the seventh end is devoured, the seven ranked in full ears. And Pharaoh woke up, and behold, it was a dream. And it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled. And he sent and called for all the musicians of Egypt and all the wise men. Now, can I put a pin here tonight? He still has Joseph in prison. And he's calling for all the musicians and the wise men of Egypt to come and to interpret his dream. Verse 8, and it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the musicians of Egypt and all the wise men, therefore, and Pharaoh told them the dream. But there was none that could interpret the dream unto Pharaoh. Then spake the chief butler to Pharaoh, saying, I do remember my faults this day. Now, after all this time has passed, 2 full years, when the butler got out, he left Joseph in prison. And he promised Joseph he was going to tell Pharaoh what he had done for him. But y'all know how people will do you sometimes. They'll promise you something when you're doing something for them. But when they have gotten what they want, sometimes people will forget about what they promised. And I want to say this tonight, if you ever promise somebody something, we ought to stand to it. Because see, we're telling that person, we're giving them hope that I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that for you. And he didn't do it. But look what happened in verse 9 here. Then spake the chief butler unto Pharaoh, saying, I do remember my faults this day. Pharaoh was wroth with his servant. He said, man, you waited 2 years since you've been out, and now you're going to bring this up about Joseph? Pharaoh in verse 10. Pharaoh was wroth with his servant and put him inward into the captain of the guard's house. Both me and the chief baker, we were dreamed a dream in one night. And I and he, we dreamed each man according to the interpretation thereof. He's telling Pharaoh about what happened in prison when he was there. He's talking about him and the butler and the baker. In verse 12, and there was there with us a young man, an Hebrew, servant to the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted to us our dream. To each man according to his dream did he interpret. Verse 13, and it came to pass as he interpreted to us, so it was. Me he restored unto mine office, and him he hanged. He's exactly the way that Joseph dreamed, exactly the way that it happened, O king of Egypt. He's talking to the king. In verse 14, then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. And he shaved his head, changed his raiment, and came in unto Pharaoh. Now look here, Joseph been in prison for a good long time now. And he's been called to come to the palace to speak to Pharaoh. And before he do anything, he takes time to present himself. He takes time to clean himself up. Took a bath, shaved his head, and put on some clean clothes. Now, I'm just saying here that the Bible mentioned this. This seems like it's minute and not really important. But when you're getting ready to do something for God, we need to make ourselves presentable. And then, because Joseph knew what his call was. In verse 14 again, then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon, and he shaved himself, changed his raiment, and came to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it. And I have heard say of thee that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. Now, I kept looking at this. I was saying to myself, why did not Pharaoh know that Joseph could interpret dreams? He had been in his house. He was the chief of everything that Pharaoh had. He was over his house, his money, his cattle, and everything that Pharaoh had. And Pharaoh thought he knew everything about Joseph. But he didn't know that Joseph had the interpretations of dreams. And what I'm trying to say tonight, a lot of times your enemy will try to figure you out and know exactly what you can and can't do. But don't never let the enemy know everything. He didn't know that Joseph had a special gift from God. And see, sometimes when your enemy attacks us, don't tell him everything. He didn't know that God still had some more in Joseph. He had just seen some of what Joseph had done. And that wasn't enough to keep Joseph out of prison. But look what's going to happen in the coming lesson. Verse 13, it said, and it came to pass, as he interpreted to us, it was me he restored unto mine office, and him he hanged. In verse 14, and Pharaoh sent and called Joseph. They brought him hastily out of the dungeon, and he shaved his head and changed his raiment and came in to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and here is none there that can interpret and give understanding of the dream. And in verse 16, and Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Can we put a pin in there? Joseph could have said that, yeah, I have the interpretation. I have the gift of interpretation. But Joseph wanted Pharaoh to know who had the power. Here he said, it's not in me. There's none that can interpret. I have heard it say, cannot understand a dream, interpret. Verse 16, and Joseph answered and said, it is not in me. I circled that on my Bible. Because sometimes we get the big head and we go to doing stuff and really helping people, but we get to thinking we doing it. And Joseph said, hold up, no, everything that is good that happened to me and through me is the Lord. And then Joseph said, God shall, not me, God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. And then see, that's faith. Now, one man already have got killed. One of his servants, the baker, that already have got killed. And now Joseph here in verse 16, he said, God should give Pharaoh an answer. And Pharaoh in verse 17, and Pharaoh said unto Joseph, in my dream, behold, I stood up on the bank of the river. And beheld, there came out of the river 7 kinds, flesh and well favored, and they fed in the meadow. And behold, 7 kinds came out of them, poor and lean. He's talking about the cows again that came up out of the river. Let's go on down to verse 20. And the lean and the ill-favored kind did eat up the first 7 fat kind. Now, I got to put a pin here tonight. He said when the first cows came out, they were fat and flushed, and they was eating in the meadow when they came out of the river. And then there was another came out of the river, another set of cows when they came out, and they was lean and poor. And then in verse 21, and when they had, in verse 20, and the lean and the ill-favored cow did eat up the first 7 fat cows. In verse 21, and when they had eaten them up, it could not be known that they had eaten them, but they were still ill-favored as the beginning, so I woke. Now, we got to look at what Joseph is saying here. Sometimes when God allows you to value your enemy, and then other folk don't see no change. They don't see what's in you. You still look the same. And what I'm saying tonight is, see, when we work through God and God works through us, God will make us look like sometimes that we ain't just got no power, no strength. Sometimes he'll make us look so weak to the enemy that the enemy think that they can do anything, that they can devour us. But the strength is not on the outside. The strength is on the inside. And what I'm saying tonight, some people will count you out because you don't look like that you're prospering. You don't look like you got no power. But it ain't what it looked like. It's what it is when you got it on the inside. And I looked at verse 22 again, and it said, and I say in my dream, and behold, 7 ears came up in one stalk, full and good. Now he goes to another part of the dream. 7 years came up, and one stalk full and good, well filled out corn. In verse 23, and behold, 7 ears withered then in blast, with the east wind sprung up after them. The fat corn came up first, and then after that, little old thin bristle corn came up. In verse 23, behold, 7 ears withered thin in blast, with the east wind sprung up after them. And the thin ears devoured the 7 good ears. And I told this the musicians, but there was none that could declare it. Pharaoh said, I told this part to the musicians, the soothsayers and all of them, magic men, and they could not interpret it. Again, look what he's saying here. The thin devoured the fat, the poor, and it looked like to be needed, divide the great and the mighty. And then it goes on here in verse 25, and Joseph said unto Pharaoh, the dream of Pharaoh is one. God has showed Pharaoh that he is about to, what he is about to do. My. Okay, we got to put a pin here tonight. God is getting ready to show Pharaoh what he's about to do. He's finna make the needy and the poor looking to become empowered. Joseph is still in jail. He don't have no power. But God is finna show Joseph that even, God is finna show Pharaoh that even though Joseph is in prison, God has not left him. And when it looked like Joseph would be down and out after being in prison for 2 years and hadn't been heard from Pharaoh, and Pharaoh hadn't even thought about him or checked on him, but God is finna turn this thing around. And now look at verse 25. And Joseph said unto Pharaoh, the dream of Pharaoh is one. God has showed Pharaoh what he's about to do. Verse 26. The 7 good kind are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dream is one. The 7 thin and ill-favored kind that came up after the 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blast with the east wind shall be 7 years of famine. He said, now, these 7 years of corn that came up, it's going to be 7 years of trouble. Ain't nothing in the land going to continue to grow. Everything is going to dry up, and there's going to be a famine in the land. Go down to verse 28. And this is the thing which I have spoken unto Pharaoh. What God is about to do, show it unto Pharaoh. Behold, there come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. God getting ready to flourish the land. Everything gonna be prosperous. Everything is gonna grow. The fields is gonna be full. The fruit trees is gonna be full. Everything that is planted is gonna come up. It's gonna be plenty within the earth for 7 years. But then look what's gonna happen after the 7 years. Verse 28, this thing which I have spoken unto Pharaoh, what God is about to do, show it unto Pharaoh. Verse 29, behold, there come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. And verse 30, and there shall arise after them 7 years of famine, and all the plenty shall be forgotten. Sometimes we're riding fat and eating good. God said, be careful when you forget about me. He said, that only lasts as long as I allow it to last. And he finna show Pharaoh that I'm finna give you more than you can think that you can ever have. But I'm doing it to show you something. Pharaoh just thought he was finna get fat and everything's gonna be all right. But Joseph also gave him the part of the dream. The stuff is getting ready to dry up. So you better try to make it get right. Verse 30, and there shall arise after them 7 years of famine, and all the plenty shall be forgotten. You forgot about how good things were after a while. And then in verse 31, and the plenty shall not be known in the land by reason of the famine follow, but it shall be very grievous. You know how sometimes when stuff is just so good and everybody is just doing so well, and somehow, you know, we go on and we forget about the Lord and what he's doing, and God has a set time. to turn the clock back and turn that thing around. And then he'll make us remember that if you forget about me, God said, look, I will come and visit you. And God is getting ready to visit them. And it's not going to be in the way that they expected, just good all the time. But he said, bad going to come after the good because they're not going to appreciate it. Look what happened in verse 32. And for that, the dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice. It is because the thing established by God, God will shortly bring it to pass. Can we put a pin on verse 32? I know my time is up tonight. And for that dream was doubled. It was repeated twice. It is because the thing established by God, God will shortly bring it to pass. He's giving him a warning. He said it twice. Get ye ready because trouble is coming. It looked good now, but he said, get ye ready because God is coming. Verse 33. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this and let him appoint officers over the land, take up the fifth part of the land in Egypt in 7 plenteous years. 7 years. He said, pick out a man. And then in verse 35, and let them gather all the food of those good years that come and lay up corn under the hands of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the city, and that the food shall be for store to the land against 7 years of famine. Now he said, everything that is planted, everything that you can pluck up, pull up, and pick, put it up in the storehouse, because trouble is coming. And second part of verse 36, and famine which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land perish not through the famine. And God is letting them know that trouble is coming. He sent his word through his servant, Joseph, and he's telling the man in charge, Pharaoh, you better get it right. Verse 37, we almost finished. And there came an end, the things was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said unto his servants, can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? Now, you would think he would know better who it is. Can we find? Now, this is Pharaoh's talking. Look at verse 37. And the thing was good in his eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said unto his servants, can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, for as much as God has showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou. He says, God showed you all of this and what's getting ready to happen. You must have a relationship with God. Now, while he was in Pharaoh's house and over all his charge, Pharaoh must then act like it that he didn't know that God had something to do with it. You remember when he first got sold into Potiphar's house and he was over everything in the land? Now here he is act like he didn't know that God had anything to do with Joseph. Verse 38, and Pharaoh said unto his servant, can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, for as much as God has showed thee all this, there is none discreet and wise as thou. Thou shalt be over my house, according to the word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. He said, Pharaoh told him, I'm going to give you charge over everything. You're going to be the number 2 man in all the land. He said, you're going to be over everybody other than me, myself. And then in verse 41, and we'll leave it alone, verse 41 and 42. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, see, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it upon Joseph's hand and arrayed him in a vesture of fine linen and put a gold chain about his neck. Can we stop for a minute? Pharaoh is going to identify Joseph as being the second man in charge throughout the whole land. and he's putting a kingly garments upon him, and he took his ring off his finger and put it on Joseph's finger to give him authority to be over everything in the land. But I just want to say tonight that Joseph didn't need Pharaoh's garments. He didn't need Pharaoh's ring, because Joseph already knew from the dream that God had gave him when he was sold into prison or into slavery, that God had gave him strength and power, and that God had gave him charge. And what I want to say tonight in us ending, when you know that God has given you charge over things in your future, and you going through life believing, having faith that God is going to do it, you're not going to need man to tell you that I'm giving you power over this and I have given you power over that, because you know it was God that moved on their heart. You know that it was God that made the way. It was God that opened the door. So we have to keep in mind, it's not what man is doing to us or for us, it's what God is working through us. And if we keep our faith and hand in God, God will continue to open up doors that man have had shut. God will continue to bring blessings and favor if we just hang in there. Well, somebody said, well, Pastor, he's in prison. What kind of favor is that? See, when God brings you down, it's sometimes when God brings us down to places that we don't want to be, it's not to hurt us, but it's to elevate us. It's to give us the appreciation to know that God is going to bring us out. When the world see us down, but then they turn around and see God anoints us and restore us and bring us back greater than we was before, that's power with God and favor with God. And then don't worry about what stuff happened to you that people know about you. They talk about you. Well, they talked about everybody. The being talked about don't make no difference when you know who you are in God. And it's in God's charge, in God's time, that he will elevate us out of whatever he allow us to go through. He'll make us get up and dust ourselves off. And people be looking and saying, I thought you were down and out. And here you are standing on your feet, going forward with strength and power, and still teaching and preaching the same word that you've been talking about. Your talk hadn't changed when you went in poverty, when you went in jail, when you went in and you were down and out. You were still talking about God. That when Joseph was in jail and he talked to these other servants of Pharaoh that came in, he was kind to them. He kept the same persona about himself. These men needed help with what was going on with him. And Joseph said, I don't owe you nothing, but because of who I am, I'm going to tell you what's going on with you. This is when you know who you are in God, at your lowest state, and you still working God's charge. And then, Lord, I know we over now. Okay, 2 minutes. Verse 42 real quick. And Pharaoh took off his ring, put it on his hand, and put it up on Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in a vesture of fine linen and gold chain around his neck. And he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried before him, bowed the knee, and made him ruler over all the land of the earth. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his hand or foot in the land of Egypt. Won't God do it? But God ain't through with this story yet. Joseph's faith is not only going to elevate him to where he is right now, but his faith is going to do some miraculous things when it comes even to his family. And when you got faith to know that whatever you go through, God is going to bring you out. And even the folk that help put you where you are, going to be able to get an opportunity to say and see that, look, it must be the favor of God that's landing on you. So we're going to leave it there tonight. Faith, it does 3 things. Faith sees the invisible. Faith believes the impossible. And faith brings forth the incredible. And next week, we're going to look at the bringing forth of the incredible. I thank everyone for signing on tonight. And we ask that you continue to Be faithful, continue to invite others to come and to be on with us in Bible study and also on Sunday morning. Again, Sunday morning is our Mother's Day celebration. And we're asking all to invite family and friends and come on out and let's just have a good time in the Lord as we celebrate our mothers, amen, and women of the church. And we're looking for a grand time in the Lord. We ask that you continue to pray for our sick. I won't go down the list because we have so many on it, and I don't want to miss anyone tonight. But I know that you know who they are, and we are asking that you just continue to be praying for all the members inside and outside of the church that we know about and affiliate with, and bid them a Godspeed. We thank you tonight. Let's come on and just turn our mics on and ask you for a very special prayer. I got to say this for Sister Gloria